My name's Hugh from SRI, and today we'd like to show you how to change or replace the built-in air compressor that's inside a lot of the GCs that we make. Typically these air compressors last for the life of the GC, but after 10 or 15 years maybe they need some kind of a service. So this particular one is making a noise. It still works, I think, but the noise is objectionable. So here's what it sounds like when I turn it on. Listen for the noise. Did you hear that kind of buzzing noise? So it's not supposed to do that. It still kind of works because we're still getting air pressure, and it's probably just a startup thing that you could ignore. So really we don't absolutely have to replace the air compressor on this GC, but we're going to because the customer wants us to. So what we do is we turn off the GC and then remove the screws around the outer part of the GC. So we remove the 6 screws. Now we've already done that, so then we can tilt the GC up on its back and lower down the lid here, and then we have access to the inside of the GC. So this is the air compressor here, right? This thing here is the air compressor. So the air compressor, the air comes out this tube, and then it goes through this filter, and then it goes out through a bulkhead on the left side of the GC, and then there we call it a jumper tube. It's just an empty tube that kind of circles back, and the air then goes to this thing called an air electronic pressure controller, or air EPC, and then the air EPC holds a certain pressure, constant pressure, very stable pressure, and sends it through this black wire over to here where there's a restrictor tube. We call it a restrictor tube because it's got a very small hole down the tube, and if you apply a certain pressure of air, you get a certain flow through the tube. So we cut the tube to whatever length and whatever internal diameter makes sense. In this case, we're feeding a flame ionization detector. So the flame ionization detector, it looks like this, and it needs 250 milliliters a minute of air. So the restrictor tube is chosen so that 5 psi of air pressure gives a flow of 250 milliliters a minute. And the air comes from this built-in air compressor, which generates about 12 psi when everything is working perfectly. So we're going to change that air compressor so that it would make sense to remove this little plate here just so that we have better access. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to loosen the 4 screws that hold this plate on. This plate holds a fan whose purpose is to cool the oven fan motor, which gets hot from just running and also from the heat that comes down from the oven itself. So we can just unclip the little fan connection and put it aside, and then we have a little better access to this. So the first thing that I'd want to remove is this tube, right? So I'm going to take my 7/16 wrench and I'm going to loosen this nut, and then I can kind of move the tube out of the way, right, so that I have access to it. So now the air compressor itself is connected electrically, and it's also connected with 4 screws to the underside of the GC. So it's very handy to have a tool like this, which is called a 5/16 nut driver, right? So it's a 5/16 nut, and it's got a kind of a long shaft, so it makes it easy for me to grab a hold of the nut. So the nuts that we use are the kind of nuts that won't vibrate loose. They have, there's a name for them, but they kind of look like this, where they have a little plastic insert, so once you tighten the nut, it really is very difficult to get it to move by vibration. You can turn it, but it won't vibrate loose, and that's what we want. So there's 4 of these nuts that hold the air compressor on. It's nice if you don't drop the nuts inside the GC, because if you do, then you have to find them, because otherwise they might cause some kind of a problem if they touch something electrical. So, I'm being as careful as I possibly can, but do I ever drop a screw? Yes, sometimes I do, but I'm always religious about finding it and retrieving it and not leaving it in the GC. So here's the last one. Okay, good. So you can see the air compressor is connected to some wires. And there's a tie wrap here that's kind of keeping the wires from unraveling. So I'm going to cut the tie wrap. And so 2 wires to connect the new one, right? So here's a new one. And you can buy a replacement one from us. They're about $350. It's expensive air compressor, but it's a nice one because it's very quiet and it lasts a long time. Okay, so we're going to have to connect the wires here. It really doesn't matter whether the blacks and the whites, or whether you connect the white to the white and the black to the black, but it doesn't hurt either, and it just looks nice. So we will end up cutting this wire and then connecting the new one, the white wire, and then the black wire. Also, we need to put this tube, transfer this tube from this air compressor to that one. So to do that, we have to unscrew the little fitting that's on there. Right, so the easiest thing to do, I think, is to take an adjustable wrench, and then we can unscrew that. This kind of fitting is meant for connecting to a piece of Tygon tubing or some kind of polymer tubing, because it's got a little barb fitting on there. But in most cases, you're going to want to take the tube that was already on there and transfer it to the new air compressor. Okay, so there I got it out. And then you can see this white stuff on there is what we call Teflon tape, right? So the Teflon tape helps to make a good seal. So I'm going to add a little more Teflon tape before I put this back together. So you start by holding it down with your thumb, and then you wrap it a few times around the threads. Don't cover the end. Try to keep the Teflon tape on the threads and not on the end. And then we'll screw that into the new air compressor. And then we'll get it nice and tight. Okay. So that's that. So now let's do the electrical connection. So I'm going to cut these 2 wires, and then I'm going to strip. They call it stripping the insulation. So you cut a little bit, but not all the way through, so that you don't cut the wires. You only cut the plastic, and then you pull, and then you've got a little bit of wire to work with. Okay, and I'm twisting the wire so it doesn't get all splayed out. And then I'm going to do the same on this side. They did pre-strip the wires, which was nice of them, but it's not really long enough to work with. So I'm going to take a little more of the insulation off. Okay, then we have to do something. There's a number of different ways to connect these wires together. One way would be to twist them and then solder them, but a lot of people don't have soldering irons. So we're going to use something called a crimp connector. So if you buy the replacement air compressor from us, we usually send you 2 or 3 of these crimp connectors, which are have little metal inserts that you can crush around the wire, and that makes a good solid connection. So here I'm going to take the 2 whites, and I'm going to take and twist them together. And then I'm going to take the crimp connector and put it over the wire part. And then we have a special tool that crimps it really nice, but you can just use a pair of pliers if you don't have this tool. So you put the part that's going to crush in the jaw, and then you squeeze it tight, really tight, and then you test it by trying to pull those wires out. If they don't come out, then that was a good connection. So we'll do the same thing with the black wire. So we're going to twist them together, and then put the crimp connector on the top, and then crimp really hard, squeeze really hard, and then yank really hard to make sure that it can't possibly come out of there. And then we're good to go. We're good to put everything back together. So notice that the air compressor has these little kind of rubber feet, right, which is something that makes it so it doesn't make a vibrating noise. And it also has these little washers that are in the feet, which keep the nut from crushing the rubber, right? So we're going to dig the 4 little washers out of the old feet. Okay, so there's my 4 washers, and I'm going to put the washers into the new one, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so when we put this back on, we'll want to make sure that in the process of putting it on, we're putting it on over some what they call threaded studs, right? Which is just like a screw sticking out that we're gonna slip the feet on top. So that should be easy, but in the process, you want to do it slow enough that you can make sure that these little washers don't fall out. I am going to turn this GC on a little bit more on its lid rather than on the side, so that I can get a better angle on this. So to do that, I'm going to remove the bottom plate. This has a green wire connected to it so that the bottom plate is grounded. So when you put it back together, be sure to put the ground wire back on. Okay, that'll make it a little easier for me to do this so that I can kind of work on it from above. So here I'm gonna put the air compressor onto those 4 little feet, threaded studs. Okay, so I'm looking at that. I'm making sure that if there's any wires that they're not in the way. I've got my 4 washers on there. So then I'm going to put the nut back on. Carefully try not to lose the nut. It's nice to have small fingers. And then I'm going to tighten it up, but I'm not going to tighten it up all the way because I don't want to crush those little rubber feet, right? I want to tighten it up to the point where it's not loose, but also I don't want to go and really crush this rubber, because then when the air compressor starts, it'll make noise. The rubber feet are designed to insulate this against vibration, right? So we don't want to tighten it up too far, just tighten it up until it's snug. So here I'm gonna get my finger in there and guide the nut on and then tighten it up. Stuff called tacky wax. You probably don't have any of this, but you could use a candle or something too, because it's kind of like candle wax. And the idea is that you put a little of this stuff on what you don't want to fall out, right? So you put a little there, and then it makes it so it doesn't just fall out by itself, right? Because it's a little bit stuck, but it's not stuck to the point where it's going to cause any problems. So you put a little bit of that wax on there. That's very helpful. Again, if you don't have it and you have small fingers, you can just guide the nut on there with your small fingers. But if you're like me, it's kind of handy to have the tacky wax. Put a little bit on there to keep it from falling out. Okay, so I've got all 4 on there, and now I'm just going to go back and tighten it up so that I can feel that it's snug, but I'm not going to go too far, and I'm just going to get it to the point of snugness, not really super tight. Okay, that's 2. Okay, just snug. Okay, that was easy. Thanks to the tacky wax. Okay, so now we are ready to put this back. So this is just copper tubing, so I'm going to bend this back into position. And I don't want it to touch anything, because again, if it touches anything, there'll be a little bit of noise from the vibration. So we're going to just adjust this by moving it around until we're connected back up to our bulkhead. And then maybe make some fine adjustments here to the position of all this. Okay, and then we'll plug it in and turn it on and see if it makes noise. So here I've got the GC power on, and now I'm going to turn the air compressor on. I don't hear a thing. That's what we like about these air compressors. They're quiet when they're working properly. So I hear it. It's not making any noise. And if I look on the front of the GC, looks like it's working perfectly. It's set at 5 psi, and the actual is 4. That's typically what it is. It's within 1 psi, and so everything's good. We're done. That's the end of the job, except we have to put this plate back. Right? So we'll plug it in. These little rubber feet basically make sure that when the GC is shipped, that if there's a severe drop, like where they drop it off the FedEx truck or something like that, that the bottom of the lid can't deform and move upward. So that it kind of reinforces itself against this bottom plate. That's the function of those little rubber feet. There's only 2 of them. The other ones are just regular screws. And then back with the bottom plate, remembering to connect the green ground wire. And you can just tighten that enough so that it's secure, and then everything goes back together. This one has an unusual paint job, but most of the lids on our GCs are red. There's an occasional different color, and you can paint the GC any color you like. We're happy to see the creativity. Anyway, thank you for the attention.